Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be embarking upon our second lecture on our introduction to the Bible, specifically how to interpret the Bible. And in that should, I hope, set us up well to start actually reading the Bible, which we are going to be starting this week. So this week we'll be reading Genesis and looking at the creation story and kind of the unfolding of the first stories about humanity that lead up to the calling of Abraham and the founding of the nation of Israel. So, by way of review, first want to talk a little bit about that original definition, and that is the Word of God in human language. That's what we basically define the Bible as last lecture. And I want to remind you that that indicates dual authorship. So there's two authors. Remember who they are? Pretty simple. You got God and you have humans. So the dual authorship for God is inspiring the Bible by revealing things. So God is not an author in the sense that God dictates or forces the hand of someone or drops the Bible out of the sky. God inspires the human authors. And then the human authors write it down. And that becomes scripture. And so we talked about a few ways that we are going to interpret the Bible as this dually authored book. Or at least talk about how Christians and Jews interpret the Bible as this dually authored book. So reading narratively, which is as a story, reading theologically, as a story about salvation, and for Christians, reading through Jesus Christ, who for us is the ultimate revelation of God and the mediator of salvation. And we'll continue to suss out what those things mean as time goes on. The second definition that I want you to know is a little bit more simple to the point, and that's that the Bible is the story of the relationship and the interaction between God and humanity. So again, remember that the Bible is not a science textbook. It's not a history textbook. The Bible is a record of an interaction. It's a record of two parties, one being God, the other being humanity, and how this relationship is founded by creation and how it unfolds. And this leads to the more specific, even more specific third definition, which is it's the story of the covenantal relationship between God and Israel. And honestly, the Judeo-Christian tradition, we could expand that not just Israel, but God and God's people. So that is how Israel understands themselves. God says, I will be your God and you will be my people, my chosen people, my covenanted people. I chose you to make this covenant with. And then when we get into the New Testament, this idea of Israel and the covenanted relationship of God with God's people morphs into this notion of the church. So Paul will talk about Israel, or the church being the new Israel. And of course, Jews do not accept this, but there's still this notion that the Bible is written about the relationship between God and God's people. And for Jews, that continues to be Israel. For Christians, that has gone beyond Israel to include Gentiles and is what is called the church. Now, how do we interpret the Bible? Well, first we need to understand what is actually happening in the authorship of the Bible, and then what is happening when we actually come to read the Bible. And so honestly, before we do that, we have to look at interpretation as a notion in general. So there's this sort of assumption, I think, that people will often have, that when they're looking at the world around them, they're just seeing it as it is. That's just how the world is. And what I see, there's a one-to-one correlation, or what I hear, or whatever I experience, there's a one-to-one correlation between that which is happening out in the world and that which I'm receiving in my mind. Now, if you think about this just a little bit harder, you know this isn't really the case. And we especially know this from human interactions. Interpretation is not something we do just when we're reading the Bible, or just when we're reading Shakespeare, or just when we're watching a movie, or just when we're having an argument or discussion, or getting to know someone. Interpretation is actually a fundamental human activity that every human is doing all the time. You are never just seeing the world the way the world is. Now, you can have correct interpretations about the world. I'm not saying that all interpretations are false, or that there are not some interpretations that are based on good criteria and reasons and are better than other interpretations. But there is still always, at every moment, an interpretation. So when I look out the window, I don't just see the tree. I look at this bottle, I don't just see the water bottle, okay? I'm seeing something more. I'm interpreting this water bottle. This is not just any water bottle, it's my water bottle. And so if you try to drink from it, I will not be happy, because it's mine. So there's an interpretation that comes with this water bottle. And this is, of course, a little banal. Of course, you know, it doesn't really matter much when it comes to water bottles. My interpretation of this water bottle doesn't really get very far from the actuality of the water bottle. But this becomes more important when it comes to interpreting events that are saturated with more complicated meanings. So, interpreting election results, interpreting what someone said, based on their tone, based on the look that they had on their face. You don't just hear the words. And so the thing is I'm not saying there's not facts. Recall the lecture on truth and relativism. There's absolutely truth. And there is something in the world that we can know. But we never know it as a one-to-one correlation. We know it through the medium of interpretation. So everything is an act of interpretation. And so while facts exist, facts do not just exist on their own. You don't just see the facts, you interpret the facts. Facts do not bespeak themselves. Facts are there and we make sense of them. Because there is no sense to just a water bottle. We need to understand its relations to the rest of the world. Facts without an interpretation, in fact, facts without a story, are not really helpful at all. So when we're talking about the Bible, we need to dispense with this notion that there's such a thing as objective interpretation. We should try to be objective. That's a good thing, but we're never going to achieve it. There is always going to be bias and presuppositions and things that we're assuming that we call a lens or a worldview. I have assumptions about the world that are always in the background, always informing the way I'm seeing the world. So I have immediate associations when I see certain things, when I hear certain things, when I hear somebody drive by and they're blasting country music versus if they're blasting pop music. I have immediate associations with what that means. I'm not saying they're negative associations. People can listen to whatever they want, but there's always, I'm assuming that something about that person, that whether it's right or wrong. And so that's why we always have to be careful. Interpretation is a careful and there's a lot at stake a lot of times in interpretation. It's a very important act that we should approach with caution, but we can't avoid it. And so when the writers of the Bible experience this in revelatory event, they don't just experience it as is. This is that human authorship aspect. They're filtering it through their own lens, through their own understanding of the world. And so this is going to affect the way that they write these things down. And we have to sort of unpack that if we are to understand what's actually being said. And first off, we need to unpack our side of things. So for the best we can, we need to take off the lenses of culture that we have. The best we can. We can't do it all the way, just like it just said. But we can isolate especially harmful biases. Biases like ancient people are stupid. Ancient people may not have known as much of us as us about an atom or a cell, but ancient people are not stupid. In fact, this is like a biological fact. The human brain hasn't developed significantly in 10,000 years. So there's not a difference in the intellectual capability or capacity of ancient people and people today. We do know more things about science, maybe about medicine, but the people knew a lot back then. In fact, for example, people never thought the world was flat. That's a myth. In fact, it was a myth created in the 19th century. People have known the world was round for millennia. That errors make texts worthless. This is a notion, people are like, the Bible has an error. It can't be the word of God. Well, not at least by the definition that we're giving to it. And also, texts can have errors and still be really, really important texts. Um, just because there is an error doesn't make the whole thing worthless. And I think a lot of these issues are actually pretty well dealt with if we avoid what we'll call literalist interpretations, interpreting the Bible exactly as what it says. The Bible is a complex historical and literary document. It's going to use metaphor. It's going to use analogies. It's going to use techniques of poetry, of writing. They'll talk about God in what we call anthropomorphic terms. God reaches out God's hand. God is looking at the world. Well, of course, God's not really reaching out some physical hand. That would be absurd. But that's a way of speaking about God. So when it says God holds the universe in God's hands, we're not thinking that's a literal meaning. Okay? That actually is a way of talking about how God sustains existence, how God sustains being. So the first interpretive matrix we use is historical interpretation. And this is how we remove barriers. So if you can imagine a group of Israelites, say, on this side, and then us on this side, and there's a river in between us, okay? In that river is culture, language, presuppositions. And so what we need to do is bridge that. We need to understand their context, understand our own, and build a point of contact so we can understand what's really going on. You do this all the time, by the way. So it's not as strange as it may sound. So, for example, if we look at a passage from Matthew 5, which we'll be reading later on this term, Jesus says, "Go the extra mile. If someone forces you to walk a mile, go an extra mile with them," which is actually where we get the phrase, go the extra mile. Well, yeah, that sounds nice, but Jesus actually has a very particular meaning there. When Jesus says, if someone forces you to walk a mile, Jesus is talking about a Roman law where Romans could force people Roman soldiers that is, could force people who were not citizens to carry their soldier gear with them for a mile. They didn't want to carry it anymore. They could hand it to a person who was not a citizen and say, "You carry my stuff. We're going to go. Can't make you go more than a mile. That would be breaking the law. But I have the right by law to make you go a mile." And so Jesus says, well, if someone does that, at the end of that mile, go, "No, I'm good. Let's keep going. Let's keep walking." And so what Jesus is providing is a way to shame that Roman soldier, because you're not doing it against your will. You're happy to do it. This is a shaming technique that is very common in the ancient world, who live by an honor-shame culture. And so this is a political context that helps us more deeply understand what Jesus is up to. He's not just saying, do something nice for someone. That's true, but there's something deeper going on. We also read from a theological interpretation. So how does the text reveal God? What does it reveal about humans? Salvation, Jesus. So in the text we'll be reading for this week, Genesis 1 through 11. First of all, the 7 days, as we'll talk about, are not literal 7 days. Okay? The point of those 7 days is to talk about God created from nothing, and God created in an orderly fashion that is recapitulated throughout the rest of creation. So why 7 days? Well, a week is 7 days. So there's a kind of order being spoken about. Or when we get to Genesis 3, there's a moment where God says that the serpent and the human, the child of the human, or the child of the woman, they're going to be in a battle. And what is this battle? That the serpent will strike the child's heel, and then he will crush the serpent's head. Well, we see that as an interpretation of Jesus. We see that, or excuse me, as a prophecy of Jesus, that this is speaking that from the human race will come someone who is going to crush the head of the progenitor of evil in the garden. So that is bespeaking Jesus. We also need to look at genre. What kind of writing is it? Now, this is more important than you might think. All right? Are we looking at history? Are we looking at poetry, epistolary literature, which is letters, prophecy, law? These texts are not all the same kind of text. The Bible isn't just one group of the same kind of text. There are different kinds of texts in it, and we need to understand how those texts work. And we do this all the time in our own life. So we wouldn't interpret a letter the same way that we would interpret a menu at a restaurant or an academic work not written to us. There are rules of interpretation that go along with genre. So maybe I say to maybe let's just do a thought experiment. For 200 years from now, there's a history class. Maybe they're doing it online like we are, and they say, you know, it's on American history, and they're looking at the presidents. They're like, you know, we found this document. It's crazy. It's called. We've talked about these before. It's a DVD, which is this ancient way that these Americans used to keep information. It's a digital video disc. They don't have our highfalutin technology now. And we found a very rare but very important source about their president, Abraham Lincoln. It turns out he wasn't just a president. He was a vampire slayer. Isn't that crazy? So it's not only that the ancient Americans believed some strange things about Abraham Lincoln, but they also believed in vampires. That's crazy, right? Well, they probably would know that we appear to believe in vampires, what with the Twilight books and all. But anyway, now this would be a massive mistake. This would not be what Americans really believed about Abraham Lincoln, because it would not understand genre. Okay? We have to understand the genre of a thing, the difference between a history textbook and a horror movie, a comedy horror movie. And so that is why we understand. So, or that is how we understand what we're really reading. This article I'm posting here, Brain Dead Teen, Only Capable of Rolling Eyes, Texting to be Euthanized. When I was on Facebook, I'm not anymore. But when I posted this, and it was an article from The Onion. If you don't know, The Onion is satire. It's a satire news site. Okay? So, I had these people, not that many, but I had this one woman in particular get on my Facebook thread, and she was just decrying how awful this was, and how could they euthanize this poor little girl, and this and that. And it's like, no, hold on now, hold on. This isn't really going to happen. This is satire, okay? Genre is so key to how we understand what we're reading and what we're interpreting. Things are written for different reasons. And the last one, is that the last one? Yeah, the last one is the notion of narratival interpretation, which is story, simply put. So the idea is that, what does this say about the overall story of God and humanity, the story of the Bible? The Bible, as a story, is going to have things that stories have. It's going to have a plot, which we're going to talk about. What is that plot? There's going to be drama. There will be characters and relationships. Israel is a character in the Bible. Israel, the whole nation. The Bible, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, is not just about a bunch of people. It's not even just about people in a nation or in a particular landscape. It is about that nation, that people as a whole. So we need to be able to understand that it's not just David or Abraham, it is Israel that we're looking at. And so we need to see that this is a relationship that creates conflict, climax, culmination, resolution. So I think we're going to stop there, and I'm going to pick up with a little bit more of what this story is and what is the narrative, and then how we can use that specifically as an interpretation. And so by looking at the Bible and understanding it from a historical perspective, looking at its genre and understanding how it's intended as it's originally written, then looking at it as a story and interpreting that from a theological point of view. That's how we're going to use and read the Bible. And that is where we'll pick up next time.